Today's webinar, we're going to talk about brakes. My name is Peyton, and I'm the Director of Business Development here at BG Curvado. If you have any questions about any of the stuff we talk about today, feel free to shoot me an email or a message, and we can talk about it. So let's go ahead and get started. So today, we're going to talk about brakes and brake systems and what usually causes issues in the brakes and stuff that you all have to deal with. And to kind of just do a quick review real quick, there's really three components of the brakes that are serviceable. No matter what you do, you're going to have to replace them at one point. And that is the brake calipers, the brake master, or excuse me, the brake pads, the brake rotor, and the brake fluid. No matter what you do, it's going to have to get replaced at one point because it is a wearable item. It wears out. Now, a caliper, if it's properly serviced, can last for more than one brake for service, right? It's not a part that has to get replaced every time. But when it comes to the pads, the rotors, and the brake fluid, you need to replace those. They are designed to wear out and they're designed to be replaced. Now, with a brake pad, there is a thickness, right? It starts thick, and as it wears out, it gets thin. If you look on these two brake pads, you'll see that one has a really large amount of material where the other one doesn't. That piece on the back is called the backing plate. And a good kind of quick reference is always if the material is less than the backing plate, it usually is pretty close to replacement or needs replacement. So what happens is over a period of time, that brake pad wears down and it's a wearable item, and that's what slows the car. That's what creates the friction to slow the vehicle. And over a period of time, they wear out. On most passenger vehicles, you're going to get 30,000 miles out of the front brakes and 60,000 miles out of the rear brakes. So usually what you'll see is your first replacement will be around 30. Then at 60, you'll do both. And then at 90, you'll do the fronts. And then at 120, you'll do both again. Now, that's not necessarily true on everything, especially on cars that have electronic parking brakes. If they have electronic parking brakes in the rear, it cuts the interval down by a lot. It's usually more about 30,000 miles, mostly on like your Subarus and a lot of those cars. So just something to be aware of. Keep an eye out of how long a vehicle takes to wear the brakes, but usually this is a pretty accurate thing. Now, when I started running shops, I really wanted to stop having comebacks. I was so sick of having brake comebacks for noise, and I decided that we're going to do it right, or we're not going to do it because it's just the biggest headache and nobody wants to deal with it. The other thing I learned is that you can also do a really cheap brake job and really not get 30 or 60,000 miles out of those brakes. And it might seem cheaper at the time, but if you're only going to get 15,000 miles out of a brake that should last you 30,000 miles, you're not really saving any money. So when you're looking at brake pads on a vehicle, the biggest thing that you want to do is let your customers know that you're going to be measuring their brake pads today and that you're going to let them know where those brake pads are. So you want to tell them the good stuff on their car too, not just the problems, right? So this is one of those items that we can test every single time and report back. Now, in most situations, people are replacing brakes between 3 and 4 30-seconds of an inch. Now, I will tell you that when you say 30 seconds of an inch, nobody has any idea what you're talking about because they don't understand what that reference is, right? Most service advisors don't know what that really means. So try to break it into a percentage. Now, every brake pad does not start at the same amount. Usually the thinner ones are wider and the thicker ones are taller, kind of a thing. But this is a good kind of reference that you can use. At 4 30-seconds of an inch, the brakes have 20% material on them and they are not going to make it to your next visit, right? Most of the times customers, we see them twice a year or every 6 months. That's why we're recommending it today. Oh, Peyton, I'm broke. I can't afford it. I just really can't do it this week. Can I drive the car? Yes, you can, but you can't drive it for 6 months without potentially causing damage. So you need to get it done sooner than later. Right? If it's at 2 30-seconds between now and the next visit, it's definitely going to cause damage. And that's why we recommend that as a now situation. And in most states that have state inspections, 2 30-seconds would be a failure. And I'll remind customers that you're at the state limit for your brakes on the minimum. It is time to do it. We got to get them done. It's needed. Right? It's kind of a good way, but learn to get away from the measurements because customers just don't understand what you're talking about and they get really confused. But measure the brake component every time, talk to the customer about it so that they know that you're teching it and they know where their brakes are. The next one, the brake rotors or the brake discs, you'll hear them called a lot. So when they come, they're very smooth across the top and they're very even. When they actually get worn by the brake pad, you can see that they get these little grooves in the top. And what this is actually the metal of the rotor wearing down with the brake pad. The rotor wears also. It's not just the brake pad. And what happens is you can see all these tiny little grooves, kind of like a record player. And we call those harmonic grooves because if you put a regular brake pad back on this surface, it's going to make rotational harmonic noise because just like a record player, it has those grooves in it that came from the previous pad. So one thing that we used to be able to do was resurface these rotors to where we could reuse them. However, because of the CAFE Act, and every year the cars have to become lighter and lighter and lighter, most of the rotors on the market are coming at the minimum amount now. So there's not enough material to be able to resurface that rotor and reuse it, okay? The problem with that is when a rotor is too thin, what happens is it starts to warp. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. As a service advisor, what you're going to hear is that my steering wheel shakes. Now, when anybody asks you that, ask them, is it when you hit the brakes or just all the time? Because if it's all the time, it's not probably a brake issue, it's probably a tire issue. But if it's only when I hit the brakes, and then you want to ask, do you feel it in the steering wheel or do you feel it in the seat of your pants? If they feel it in the seat of your pants, it's usually the rear brakes, which is not as common as feeling it in the front brakes, because on the steering wheel, you're going to feel it shake like this. It's very noticeable, okay? So that's what happens if you decide to reuse a rotor or cut a rotor that's too thin. It will overheat, it will warp, and they're not going to get the full life out of those brakes that they wanted to. I kind of learned a long time ago that cutting the corner and trying to save rotors isn't really worth it for you or the customer. If you save them $200 by pad slapping a car, and that means just putting brake pads on it and trying to clean it up, it's either going to make noise or you're going to have a vibration within 15,000 miles. They're not going to get the full use out of those brakes. You're going to have to do them again prematurely, and it's not going to be free the second time, right? So it doesn't really save you any money in the long run. Now, with the rotor, when we talk about it warping or being too thin or thick, there are ways to measure this. So what you're going to do is grab a micrometer. If you have a state inspector, ask them to show you. They do this a lot because they have to measure this stuff. You'll look it up in the tech book, and it'll give you a minimum thickness. But just a quick reminder, most of them out there now are coming at minimum thickness, so you don't have any space to resurface them. The second one is measuring lateral runout, or basically the warping of the metal, the not flatness of the metal. So you can actually measure it to where there's high spots in the rotor. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in here in a second. So there is a variation. If you want to look it up, there is a spec for that, but usually you're going to feel it in the steering wheel and notice, and the customer is going to complain about it because it's very obvious when it does it. So as a brake rotor spins, it's nice and even, right? It's smooth. When those brake pads squish on the side of it, it doesn't have a problem, right? It's even. Now here, you can see it's a little crooked. This could be caused by not just the rotor. It could be a bent hub. It could be over torquing of the wheels, right? So it could just be the rotor. This is why you need to check it and have a technician look at it. But when that rotor starts to spin, you're going to see here in a second, it's not smooth. So when you push the brake pads on it, it makes the wheels shake, which in turn makes the steering wheel shake for the customer. And that's a really big complaint that we get when brake jobs aren't done properly. And then it overheats the rotor, and then they have to come back because it's vibrating and they're not happy. The next one is brake fluid. So we sell two main types of brake fluid, a .4, and then the new stuff is going to be your low viscosity brake fluid, 5.1, low conductivity for Priuses, for Teslas, and other uses. Now, all brake fluid is hydrostatic. It is going to absorb water no matter what you do about it. If you open it, please make sure you seal it tight because it will go bad. So what that means is we don't want the brake fluid to boil. It's going to get really hot in there. If it boils, our brake pedal is going to do nothing. It's going to feel like hitting a sponge and the car's not going to stop. It happens a lot when you're racing if you don't do your brake fluid properly. So what happens with moisture is as the moisture gets in the brake fluid, the moisture content goes up. The firmness of the brake pedal and the stopping power that is transferred through it goes down. as the boiling point goes down, which is how like a scientist or a chemist would measure the actual point of it. Okay. So that's what happens as the moisture gets absorbed, it gets dirty, it starts having corrosion issues. It'll actually start rusting inside the lines. So that's why you want to keep moisture out of the systems. Now, like I said, low viscosity. Because of cafe and a lot of other things, we're going pretty much low viscosity on almost all of our fluids. So what that means is that if you were to pour them at the same time, the low viscosity would move faster. It's a faster moving fluid. It takes less energy to push it faster. So the reason we need that now is because of collision avoidance, parking assist, lane cruise controls, radar cruise control, because the car can now stop the car faster than you can. So it needs to have a faster responding brake fluid, which is what a low viscosity brake fluid is. So just heads up, this is coming. If you haven't seen it yet, you're going to see it. A lot of shops are just switching to our 5.1 because it is backward compatible and you can use it on everything. And then you have one fluid, you use it on everything, you're good to go. So how do we test brake fluid? Okay, so there's a couple ways to do this. One is using a brake test strip. So what this does is it measures the amount of copper that are coming out of the lines, because that's what happens when it gets corroded internally. And when you see the copper in it, you know that it's bad. Okay, there's a chart on here that gives you a reference of how much copper is in it. And that way you can tell the customer, hey, look, we did this actual brake fluid test and we can show you that it is bad. One of my favorites is electronic tester. I will tell you that these are for sale from $80 to $7. And it seems like when you pay more for them, they last a little bit longer. One tip, these little electrodes at the end, don't get the plastic wet in the fluid. If you keep it dry, they'll last a lot longer, but they start leaking because the brake fluid gets in there and kind of eats the seals. So what this is, and they make an OTC version of this, they make a bunch of versions of this. It measures moisture. So 3% moisture is basically a no good point. They've been trying to pass state inspection laws for that to be a failure, but they need testing equipment that can be accurate. And it's a big issue right now. But at 3%, it's time for it to go. At 2, I would recommend it. What you're going to learn that when you test brake fluid is that pretty much every 2 years, 30,000 miles, it's going to need it. So a lot of shops just recommend it on time and mileage because in their experience, they know that it's probably going to be bad by then, or it's going to be dirty by then, or we're going to need to do the brakes anyway, and we need to service it with the brakes. So once you kind of start servicing it with the brakes, it'll kind of fall in line and get done kind of when it needs to, because it's at the next interval the brakes need it. Another one is service history, right? Has it been done before? If not, I'm sure the fluid is contaminated and it's time to change it. Some places still recommend brake fluid on color. It's not a bad option, obviously, if it's very discolored. I can guarantee you it's probably going to fail one of these tests. But again, almost every manufacturer out there is recommending this every 2 years on every vehicle. We've seen a couple that seem like they want to go even sooner than that, but I haven't actually seen it enforced yet. So just kind of a heads up that this stuff is coming. And then lastly, with a brake service is usually the best time to recommend it. So a couple of things that I learned over the years when I was trying to develop like a no comeback brake job. One, obviously using a halfway decent set of pads and rotors is a big part of it, but there's a lot of other items. And I think we have to deal with a lot of cleaning and debris from previous technicians that didn't do it. So it builds up really bad, especially a lot of old greases and things like that. So you got your brake job, right? When you take your brakes apart, the first step is to clean it, remove it all off and clean it, because this metal surface where this rotor is going to sit is not clean. It's not flat, right? It needs to be flat so that it sits flat and we don't have a warping issue later. The second one is clean it really well. So get some brake clean, get abrasive pads, clean everything off. We have a really great brake clean that's really strong. And then thirdly, a big mistake I see a lot of people is lubricating them. Most of the lubricants that I've seen on the market, they suck. They, in a year, they're gunky. The pads, you got to use a screwdriver to pull them out. And I'll be honest with you, I was a BG customer and I fell in love with their brake grease because it doesn't stop moving. And in 3 years from now, you can just take the brake pad apart and it's no big deal. It doesn't get stuck like it used to. So what we would see a lot of is this, right? It's contamination. A lot of this is moisture because there's moisture in there. It's rusting, right? So the BG stuff I found out is waterproof. Because of that, you don't have these issues. So make sure that you're using a good grease, the proper grease for what you're using. It needs to be able to handle high temp, low temp, and it should be waterproof. So we do sell it in little single packs. We sell it in tubs, and we also sell it tubes and buckets and everything else that you can imagine. But this is another issue, that a reason I see that brake jobs come back is that things aren't lubricated properly, and that becomes the issue. Lastly, stop squeal. Really great product. So what you do is you put this on the brake pad, it absorbs into the brake pad, and it limits the vibrations and prevents vibrations from happening, which is usually where your brake noises are coming from on the pad. This is kind of a home run insurance policy that you can guarantee yourself that you're not going to have any brake jobs come back. So how do we talk to a customer about this? So I try to break these things out into 3 steps. First one is the inspection, right? It's not just that we did it, it's that we explained it to the customer and they understand that we did it. Second, what is the problem, right? It's not you need brakes. Why do you need brakes? Well, because your brake pads are low, they're at 10%. That's why you need brakes, right? The solution to that is replacing the brakes, okay? So the way you'd want to explain this is the technician did a road test and on the rack inspection of your brakes. He did not feel or hear anything with your issue, He did not feel or hear any brake issues during the road test. This is a really important line because what happens is if you don't hear it, you assume the customer doesn't hear it. And then you try to not fix it or whatever happens, and then the noise comes back. So by me saying this, if they do hear the noise, then they're going to go, oh no, Peyton, it makes a noise. Like it definitely makes a noise, right? So that's why I confirmed to them what we found, okay? Then he did notice your front brake pads only have 10% left, and we tested your brake fluid, which is at 3% moisture, which fails a test. So he's recommending to replace the front brakes and replace the brake fluid, right? So why do I have to replace the brake fluid? We get a lot of this, right? We get a lot of this. One of the reasons is because it goes bad, not like it used to. And we needed to do a lot more things than it used to. And when it does go bad now, it causes a lot more problems that become a lot more money. But every manufacturer is recommending this now because cars are lighter. They're not dissipating heat the same. The brake fluid gets a lot dirtier than it used to and is doing a lot more than it ever did. That's why the manufacturers are recommending this pretty much on every manufacturer across the board, every 2 years, every 30,000 miles. So when somebody asks me this, I like to explain to them that moisture, because they don't know, right? It's like somebody just saying to you like, well, why do I have to clean my air conditioning then? I've never had to do it before. I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me. So when they ask you this, they're not challenging you. They're just asking you to explain it. Hey, look, I totally understand, right? I know that this is not something that you normally would do on an older vehicle, but now the brake fluid does a lot more than it used to, and it absorbs moisture and it goes bad. We measured it. If it was a 1 or 2, we would usually let it go. But when it's 3 or 4, it's done its job and it's ready for replacement. It's time to replace it before it has a bigger issue, right? It's done its job. Another one, you'll get a lot. Why is it so expensive? You know, brakes are more expensive than they've ever been between having to replace rotors all the time and doing brake fluid flushes. But what they're really asking you in this is, hey, look, Peyton, why do I need to spend so much money? Because it's a lot of money. Just make me feel good about this and just tell me what's going on. Hey, look, Sean, I totally understand. We're replacing your brake pads, your brake rotors. We're going to clean everything. We're going to lubricate everything really good. And we're going to change the brake fluid. It's a lot of work. You know, it's going to take us a few hours at least. And then we're going to actually test drive it, make sure everything's good. And when we do everything right the first time, you're going to get the most mileage out of that next brake service. And that's what you're really doing. Because they can go somewhere and get a $300 brake service, but it's not going to last them more than 12 months because they're the cheapest pads and the cheapest rotors, and there's a reason that they're the cheapest, right? Why do I have to replace the rotors? This is a big one because people don't get it, right? We've resurfaced them in the past. They didn't always have to replace them. Oh, my buddy just put pads on them. I don't know what you're talking about, right? Look, rotors are wearable and they're softer than they've ever been because they're not iron like they used to be. So they wear, right? And secondly, we can't resurface them. So you can't do a proper brake job that you can guarantee is not going to make noise or vibrate without selling the rotors. So to do the job properly, to get it to the next mileage, you really need to replace the rotors. So one thing to remember, the big reason that this all happened is out of nowhere, we have brake fluid replacements across the board, right? Everybody's seeing them now. It wasn't like that 20 or 30 years ago. Congress passed the CAFE Act. Cars have to be lighter. The calipers that we're using are not these big iron things that can dissipate heat like they used to. So what the manufacturers said is, look, we can make the switch to these tiny alloy calipers, but we're going to have to change the brake fluid every 2 years or it's going to cause problems. So that's when all of a sudden they started doing that because, again, it can't dissipate the heat. So most manufacturers are doing this. I've even seen, I think it was on a Nissan that had lane avoidance. It was 15,000 miles was a recommendation for the brake fluid because with all these active systems, it has to respond faster than it ever has before. The brake fluid is a really big part of that. And you got to make sure you're using the right one now, because if it's a low viscosity fluid and you're not using a low viscosity fluid, that's definitely going to cause an issue. Now, talking about servicing the brakes, we do have two great pieces of equipment for brake fluid services. These are really the Mac Daddies. These are pieces of equipment probably get used more than anything else in the shop because by far brake fluid flushes are probably one of the most common services that are sold. So our machines are really fantastic. We do sell dot 4 and dot 5.1 with brake clean and without. The reason for this is a lot of shops choose to sell the brake clean as a part of the parts so that they get a markup on it and they can make a little bit of money on the brake clean and sell it as a kit to the customer. Okay. We also have all the adapters for the machines to make it easy. They fit. We have them for pretty much every vehicle out there. We have a few universal ones in case those don't fit. They don't leak. They work fantastic. This is probably my favorite tool that we have because the brake flush machines are just great. They have a return line so that when you hook it up to the bleeder screw, as you're doing it, you don't have to worry about a bucket on the floor. It has a little hook and everything, and you can hook it up right there and just suck all the fluid out, and it's super easy. One other thing that a lot of shops use is they'll use a stop squeal service kit that comes with grease. So that when you sell a brake job, they'll sell this along the side with it, and that way you get the grease taken care of and you get the stop squeal, no problem. Now, speaking of brake clean, like I said, we do sell it along the side with kits, so you can kind of inventory it. When a job gets sold, you give them a can of brake clean. We also do sell it by the can, and we sell it in a drum and a metal can for our refillable sprayer. So this is an OSHA certified refillable sprayer. If you need that or have any questions about that, please let us know. It's absolutely badass, and it works very, very well. The biggest difference with our brake cleaner is it's a lot stronger than most of the brake clean on the market. So you'll see kind of in this video real quick, this is the AC Delco versus BG, how much the BG can clean off everything in the thing, and you'll see what the AC Delco does. So the brake clean is definitely stronger. If you'd like to see some, please let us know, and we can kind of show you what it looks like and show you the gun. It's some pretty cool stuff. So as I recap today, I just want to remind you that brakes are the biggest thing you're going to sell all the time, every day. That and fluid maintenance is because every car is going to need it, right? Usually every 2 years, 30,000 miles. This is something that you want to get good at. Work on practicing, work on talking to people about how they sell these services, because you're going to sell more brakes than probably anything else out there. So what I found works the best is when you're talking to the customer, explain what you're going to do on the inspection. Hey, we are going to road test it. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. When you explain these things, they don't mind paying for checkout fees. But when you just tell them there's a fee and it has a short little name, they question it, right? So you got to explain what you're doing and tell them what they're going to do. Okay, make sure you measure every brake pad on every car, check every brake fluid on every car, right? You never know, and it's your job to check it because the customer is expecting you to check it, and then go over that result with them. They don't want to just hear from you when there's stuff that's needed. Call them and say, hey, we checked your brakes. They're great. You got 60%. We checked your tires. They're at 80%. Your air filters look good, right? Go over the good stuff too, so that they can feel good about taking care of their car and not just beating them up about all the bad stuff all the time. And then lastly, take care of your customers and your team by doing proper brake jobs. Them getting longer mileages out of those brakes is going to save them so much money in the long run, and they get protection on the BG warranty with the brake fluid. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or your rep. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great week.